Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really jarring contradiction in global healthcare. We're looking at a system that pulls off absolute miracles every single day, but somehow, inexplicably, struggles to serve its own people. When you think of medical titans on the world stage, a few countries probably spring to mind, right? Well, right now we're zeroing in on a nation that has quietly and then very loudly become a total global epicenter for life-saving surgeries. But beneath the surface of this truly remarkable medical success story is a deeply complex, incredibly human problem. It's a paradox of just immense proportions. And to really grasp the mechanics of global healthcare today, we've got to unpack exactly how this divide was created. Let's get into it.
Let's start with a totally staggering fact. India alone performs a massive 1/3 of all organ transplants globally. Just pause and think about that for a second. 1 out of every 3 transplant surgeries happening anywhere on Earth, whether that's a kidney transplant or an incredibly complex liver or heart procedure, is taking place in India. This stat absolutely cements the country as a powerhouse in the medical world. It really speaks to the world-class expertise of its surgeons, the cutting-edge tech in its top-tier hospitals, and just a wildly robust medical infrastructure that can actually handle that enormous volume of procedures. By any traditional metric, this is a huge triumph of modern medicine.
But, and this is a big but, here's the paradox we're investigating today. Despite that massive global output, India meets only a tiny fraction of its own staggering domestic demand for organs. So on one hand, you have this unparalleled capability. It's drawing patients from all corners of the globe who are looking for top-notch and honestly often more affordable medical care. But on the flip side, you have millions of Indian citizens who are in desperate need of those exact same life-saving organs, and they're just left waiting. It's a classic, though tragic, tale of supply and demand. The supply is undeniably there, it's abundant, but it is inexplicably missing the massive domestic demand sitting right in its own backyard.
Section 1. A fraction of the need. Let's visualize this divide.
So, the crucial point here is understanding what this domestic shortfall actually looks like on the ground. Because we can't just talk in abstractions, right? We need to ground this in reality for the people caught in the middle of it. The dramatic tension here is just obvious. The towering demand from patients on the domestic waiting list is astronomical. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people suffering from end-stage organ failure, just hoping for a second chance at life. Now compare that to the incredibly low number of actual surgeries performed for domestic citizens. The disparity is honestly breathtaking. It's not just a gap, it's a chasm. What this tells us is that having the medical chops to perform 1/3 of the world's transplants simply does not automatically translate to healthcare equity at home.
Section 2. Unpacking the massive gap. Let's figure out exactly why this exists.
Okay, let's dive into this and play detective for a minute. Because a gap this massive doesn't just happen by accident. It's actually the result of a few overlapping forces, some economic, some infrastructural, and some deeply cultural. First up, you have booming medical tourism, which fundamentally changes the market dynamics. Then there's a severe shortage of deceased donors, and that's really the backbone of any successful national transplant program. Third, you've got massive infrastructural bottlenecks. India is a vast country, and transporting a viable organ across it is a literal logistical nightmare. And finally, and maybe the most complex piece of this whole puzzle, are the deep-rooted cultural stigmas surrounding organ donation after death. Each of these is a massive roadblock on its own, but together, they create a perfect storm.
A major piece of this puzzle is that the system relies incredibly heavily on living donors. Right now, the vast majority of transplants in India, things like kidney and partial liver transplants, come from living family members. But here's the thing, relying on living donors has a hard ceiling. Think of it like trying to build an entire house using only the spare parts you can borrow from your neighbors. You might snag a door or a window, but you absolutely cannot borrow a foundation. In the same way, you can't get a heart from a living donor. The pool of deceased donors, which is absolutely crucial for scaling up and meeting that huge demand we were just talking about, remains critically low. Many families are hesitant to consent to organ donation when a loved one passes away. This is often due to religious beliefs, misinformation, or honestly just the overwhelming grief of that moment. Without a robust deceased donor program, the math is just never going to work in favor of the domestic waiting list.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the double-edged sword of being a global medical hub. See, medical tourism is a massive economic driver. It brings international prestige, it brings vital revenue to hospitals, and it actually helps fund the very technologies that make these surgeries possible in the first place. But there is a finite amount of surgical time, a finite number of hospital beds, and only so many top-tier surgeons. When international patients travel to India for transplants, it inherently pulls highly specialized resources away from domestic needs. It is a really delicate balancing act. The very thing that makes India a transplant powerhouse on paper is actively contributing to the domestic shortage on the ground. Crazy, right?
And all of this builds into an incredible logistical hurdle. Let's say a family does overcome the cultural stigma and actually consents to a deceased donation. The clock immediately starts ticking. Step 1 is the rigorous and honestly often legally complex process of brain death certification. Step 2 is rapid organ retrieval, which means you need a specialized surgical team on standby. And Step 3 is the famed green corridor transport. I want you to picture this, trying to navigate an ambulance through the chaotic, hyper-congested streets of Mumbai or Delhi with literally minutes to spare. Moving a viable organ like a heart, which only lasts a few hours outside the body, requires intense police coordination to physically halt city traffic so that ambulance can just fly through. It is an absolute logistical race against time.
Behind all this data are real human lives. As the experts point out, the gap between the thousands who need organs and the hundreds who actually get them is driven by these complex infrastructural and cultural hurdles. Establishing those green corridors and fighting that societal stigma is a monumental daily battle. We're talking about doctors having to act as grief counselors, police officers acting as lifeline facilitators, and surgeons working against a strict biological ticking clock. These numbers represent thousands of individual tragedies and triumphs every single year. The sheer effort required just to pull off one successful deceased donor transplant is staggering, and it really underscores exactly why the domestic numbers remain so stubbornly low despite the huge overall output.
Section 3. Bridging the divide. Here's how we start fixing the paradox.
Okay, so we've seen the problem. We understand the bottlenecks, the cultural barriers, and the absolute logistical nightmares. So, what actually needs to change to finally align India's domestic supply with its domestic demand? Well, the absolute key to closing this gap is unlocking a massive, untapped slice of potential through donor awareness. The current deceased donor pool is highly effective, but it's dangerously narrow. That huge remaining untapped potential, that represents the viable organs lost every single year simply because families didn't know their loved one's wishes. Or maybe because the hospital just didn't have a transplant coordinator trained to ask the family at the right moment. The solution here doesn't require inventing some brand new medical technology. It requires a societal shift.
To heal its own population, the system really needs to aggressively tackle these specific roadblocks. First up, streamlining the logistical infrastructure. That means standardizing brain death certification across all hospitals, not just the super elite ones. Second, expanding those green corridor networks, which means utilizing helicopters and commercial airlines way more efficiently to move organs across the country. And third, launching massive donor awareness campaigns to destigmatize deceased organ donation. We're talking about integrating organ donation education into medical schools, running public service announcements, and doing real community outreach. The ultimate goal is to make pledging your organs as culturally normalized as giving blood. Now you might be wondering, why should you care if India standardizes its certification or builds green corridors? Because solving this specific bottleneck creates a blueprint for global healthcare equity everywhere.
India's transplant ecosystem is a total marvel of modern medicine. It's a true testament to human skill and ingenuity. But, as we've seen, it is also a really profound lesson in the complexities of healthcare economics and cultural infrastructure. I want to leave you with this provocative thought about healthcare equity to consider long after this explainer wraps up. As borders become more and more porous for folks seeking medical care, how do nations balance their duty to the global community with the urgent, desperate needs of their own citizens? Thank you so much for exploring this paradox with me today, and keep questioning the data behind the headlines.